In the heart of Lagos, Nigeria, nestled within the bustling streets of a middle-class neighborhood, lived the Ajay family. Mr. Ajay, a diligent office worker, and his wife, Mrs. Ajay, a market trader, had built a modest life for themselves and their 3-year-old daughter, Amara. Their flat, located in a crowded block of apartments, was simple but well-kept, with a small kitchen that doubled as a dining area and a living room that served as both a relaxation and play space. Mr. Ajay was known for his punctuality and hard work at his 9-to-5 job in a law firm downtown. He woke up every day before dawn, dressed in his neatly ironed shirts and trousers, and took the rickety bus through the congested streets of Lagos to his office. His wife, Mrs. Ajay, equally hardworking, left home a little later to manage her market stall, where she sold vegetables, grains, and household items to the busy shoppers of the city. She was known for her sharp tongue, quick wit, and the freshness of her produce. Together, they managed to provide a decent living for their little daughter, Amara. Amara was the light of their lives, bright-eyed, curious, and always on the move. At 3 years old, she was an adventurous child, fascinated by everything around her. Her tiny footsteps could often be heard pattering around the flat, exploring every nook and cranny. She was a handful, but she was their handful, and they loved her fiercely. Their days revolved around keeping her safe, entertained, and happy. On this particular day, the sun shone brightly over Lagos, casting a golden hue on the neighborhood. Mr. Ajay had just returned from his office, tired but relieved to be home. The evening air carried the smell of street food and the distant sounds of hawkers calling out to potential customers. Inside the Ajay family's flat, things were quieter, though equally busy. "Welcome, my husband," Mrs. Ajay greeted him, her voice warm and welcoming as she busied herself in the kitchen. She was making a pot of her famous jollof rice, its spicy aroma filling the air. The pot simmered on the gas cooker, and she added a pinch of salt, tasting the concoction with a satisfied smile. "How was work today?" she asked, raising her voice to be heard over the clatter of pots and pans. "Long," Mr. Ajay replied, taking off his shoes and slumping into the faded sofa in the living room. "But it's good to be home." "Where's Amara?" "She's playing in the corner with her toys. But keep an eye on her. You know how she likes to wander," Mrs. Ajay reminded him, wiping her hands on her apron. She had one eye on the stove and another on her daughter, who was happily stacking plastic blocks in a corner of the living room. Minutes passed, and Mr. Ajay's eyes began to droop. The rhythmic sounds of the city outside and the comforting smell of cooking lulled him into a state of drowsiness. He stretched out on the sofa, telling himself he'd rest his eyes for just a moment. But moments turned into minutes, and he soon drifted off into a light sleep. Meanwhile, in the kitchen, Mrs. Ajay remembered that she had left some vegetables outside in the courtyard to dry. "Ajay, I'm stepping out for a moment," she called out, assuming he was still awake. "I'll be right back. Please watch Amara." There was no response from her husband, who was now softly snoring, but she didn't notice. She turned off the stove but left the gas cylinder on. She hurried outside, expecting to return in just a minute or two. Inside, Amara, who had grown bored with her toys, stood up and looked around. Seeing both her parents preoccupied, or so she thought, her eyes turned to the kitchen. She had always been fascinated by the colorful pots and the sounds of cooking, and she saw an opportunity to explore the forbidden area. Her tiny feet pattered across the floor as she made her way to the kitchen. She pushed open the door and peeked inside, her eyes wide with curiosity. The gas cooker stood there, with the flame now extinguished, but the gas valve was still open. Beside it was the large, imposing gas cylinder. Amara had seen her mother fiddle with it before and wondered if it was another toy to play with. She reached out with her small hands and began to twist the gas cylinder's valve. The hissing sound startled her, but she giggled, thinking she had discovered something new. She twisted it again, and the hissing grew louder. The gas, invisible and odorless to a child's senses, began to fill the small kitchen, slowly seeping into the rest of the house. Amara, pleased with her newfound toy, continued to fiddle with the valve, unaware of the growing danger. Her tiny hand slipped, and she accidentally disconnected the gas hose from the cylinder, causing a rapid release of gas. The hissing turned into a roar, but the little girl, in her innocence, didn't understand. She stood there, looking around as if waiting for applause for her accomplishment. Back outside, as she gathered the dried vegetables, a sudden chill ran down Mrs. Ajay's spine. She could not place the feeling, but it was strong enough to make her drop what she was doing. She hurried back toward the flat, her mind racing with thoughts of what might have gone wrong. She pushed open the front door and immediately smelled it, the acrid scent of leaking gas. "Amara!" she screamed, rushing toward the kitchen. "Amara, where are you?" Mr. Ajay jolted awake at his wife's frantic cries, his heart leaping into his throat. The smell hit him next, sharp and overwhelming. "Jesus! The gas!" he shouted, leaping off the sofa. "Where's Amara?" Just then, as Mrs. Ajay reached the kitchen door, the unthinkable happened. A tiny spark from the flick of a faulty switch which Amara just put on ignited the gas-filled room. The explosion was immediate and violent, blasting through the kitchen with a deafening roar. The force of the explosion flung Mrs. Ajay backward into the hallway, knocking her breathless. Mr. Ajay, rushing toward her, stopped dead in his tracks as a wall of fire erupted from the kitchen. "No!" he screamed. "Amara!" Inside the kitchen, a shrill scream pierced the chaos. Amara, who had been standing near the gas cylinder, was thrown against the opposite wall by the force of the blast. The fire quickly engulfed the curtains, the wooden cabinets, and anything that would burn. The flames leapt hungrily, reaching out like fiery hands to claim more of the room. Amara, her tiny body singed and her clothes starting to catch fire, screamed in terror and pain. "Amara!" Mr. Ajay shouted, his voice breaking as he lunged toward the inferno. The heat was unbearable, and the smoke was already thick, stinging his eyes and choking his lungs. He could barely see, but he could hear his daughter's cries. "God, please, help me," he prayed aloud, his voice a mix of desperation and resolve. He grabbed a blanket from the sofa, doused it in a nearby bucket of water that was kept for mopping, and wrapped it around himself. He knew he had only seconds. With a deep breath, he charged into the flames, feeling the intense heat searing his skin even through the wet fabric. Inside, the scene was a vision of hell. The fire had already spread to the ceiling and walls, and the heat was so intense it felt like it was burning through his bones. But then he saw her, Amara, his little girl, lying on the floor, her tiny body writhing in pain, her cries weaker now, almost lost amid the roar of the flames. "Amara!" he shouted, his voice raw. He dashed forward, scooping her up in his arms. Her skin was hot to the touch, and her dress was smoldering. He could feel the burn on his own skin as he held her close, shielding her with his body. He turned and ran, every second feeling like an eternity. As he stumbled back into the hallway, his wife grabbed them both, her hands trembling and her face streaked with tears. "Oh God, Amara!" she cried, trying to soothe her daughter, whose cries were now weak whimpers. "We need to get out. The fire is spreading." They ran toward the front door, smoke filling their lungs and eyes, making it almost impossible to see or breathe. The flames were now devouring the living room, and the sound of glass breaking and wood crackling filled the air. The flat was becoming a death trap. Outside, the explosion had already drawn the attention of the neighbors. The neighborhood quickly erupted into chaos. People shouted and ran, some rushing to the Ajay family's aid with buckets of water, while others shouted for someone to call the fire department. The sound of panic filled the street, a chorus of fear and urgency. "Fire! Fire!" a woman screamed, clutching her chest as she watched the smoke billow out from the windows. Inside, the Ajay family reached the front door, only to find that the fire had spread faster than they could escape. The flames blocked their exit, climbing the walls and devouring everything in their path. The heat was suffocating, and the smoke was growing thicker, turning the once familiar space into a deadly maze. "Jesus, help us!" Mr. Ajayi shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the flames. His arms tightened around Amara, whose small body had gone limp in his embrace. Her breathing was faint, and her cries had quieted to pained whimpers. He could feel her tiny chest rising and falling rapidly against his own, and he knew they were running out of time. "We have to find another way out," Mrs. Ajayi cried, her voice choked with smoke and fear. She glanced around, her eyes wide and desperate, searching for any possible escape route. The windows! She darted toward the living room window, only to find the curtains already ablaze, the flames licking up the walls and turning the air into a furnace. Back! "We can't get out this way," she yelled, turning back to her husband. "We have to try the back door." She grabbed his arm, pulling him and Amara toward the narrow corridor that led to the kitchen's back entrance. As they stumbled down the hallway, the smoke grew denser, making it harder to breathe or see. Each step felt like a fight for survival, their lungs burning with every breath they took. The fire was a living beast, consuming everything in its path. The walls around them seemed to pulse with heat, threatening to close in on them at any moment. "Keep moving! Don't stop!" Mr. Ajayi urged, his voice barely a whisper now, strained from the smoke. He could barely see his wife in front of him, her form a blur through the thick smoke. He felt his legs growing weaker, his steps becoming more labored. His arms ached from carrying Amara, but he could not let go. They reached the kitchen's back door, but their hopes were dashed in an instant. The fire had spread through the kitchen, and the entire area was engulfed in flames. The back door was blocked by the inferno, the metal knob glowing red-hot, making it impossible to touch. "No! No, no, no!" Mrs. Ajayi cried out, despair filling her voice. She looked back at her husband, her face streaked with tears and soot. "We're trapped, Ajayi. We're trapped." The realization hit them both like a punch to the gut. The fire was everywhere, and there was no way out. Their home, their sanctuary, was now a blazing death trap. Mr. Ajayi felt a surge of panic rising in his chest, but he forced it down. He couldn't give in to fear, not now, not when his daughter's life depended on it. He scanned the room, his mind racing. Then he remembered the bathroom. It had a small window that led out to the side alley. It was their last chance. "This way," he shouted, grabbing his wife's hand and dragging her toward the bathroom. They stumbled through the smoke-filled corridor, coughing and choking, their eyes stinging and watering. They reached the bathroom and slammed the door shut behind them, momentarily cutting off the flames. The small room was filled with smoke, but the fire had not yet reached it. Mr. Ajayi rushed to the tiny window above the bathtub. It was small, too small for an adult to fit through, but maybe, just maybe, they could squeeze Amara through. "Break it! Break the glass!" Mrs. Ajayi shouted, grabbing a metal bucket from the floor and slamming it against the window. The glass shattered, falling out in jagged pieces. She quickly cleared away the shards with her hands, ignoring the cuts that formed on her palms. "Hand her to me," Mr. Ajayi urged, trying to widen the opening with his hands. "We can pass her through and call for help." He gently but urgently passed Amara through the opening, her small body slipping through with only a bit of difficulty. She was so still, her breath so faint. He could see the burns on her skin and the singed hair on her head, and his heart broke with fear and anguish. "Amara, baby, hold on," he pleaded. "Just hold on." Outside, the chaotic scene continued. Neighbors had gathered in numbers, some with buckets of water, others with sand, all trying desperately to do something, anything, to help. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and the sounds of panicked voices. Chinedu, the young mechanic from 2 doors down, was among the crowd. He saw Mr. Ajayi's head pop out of the small bathroom window, holding a lifeless-looking Amara in his arms. He sprang into action. "Over here! Help me!" he shouted, rallying a few other young men to his side. They raced toward the side of the building, forming a makeshift ladder with their bodies to reach the window. "Take her! Please, take her!" Mr. Ajayi cried out, his voice breaking. He passed Amara down to Chinedu, who took her carefully but quickly, cradling her in his strong arms. "I got her! I got her!" Chinedu shouted. "Get out of there, Mr. Ajayi! We need to get you out." But the window was too small for the adults to fit through. Mr. Ajayi knew this, and his heart sank with the realization that he and his wife were still trapped. "Save my daughter! Save Amara," he called down. "Just save her. Don't talk like that. We'll get you out too." Chinedu yelled, but the fire was spreading too fast. The flames were now licking up the walls outside, threatening to engulf the entire building. The firefighters arrived at that moment, their red truck screeching to a halt in front of the apartment complex. They quickly unrolled their hoses and began spraying water into the inferno, trying to control the blaze. "We have people trapped inside," one of the neighbors shouted at the firemen. 2 adults still inside. Inside the bathroom, the smoke was thickening. Mr. Ajayi could barely see his wife through the haze. "Ajayi," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "what if we don't make it?" He grabbed her hand, his grip tight and reassuring despite his own terror. "We will make it," he said, though his voice wavered with uncertainty. "We have to." The fire outside their door roared louder, and the heat intensified. The walls seemed to tremble, the very foundation of the building groaning under the strain. Suddenly, they heard a loud, terrifying crack, like the sound of bones breaking. "The roof!" Mrs. Ajayi screamed, looking up in horror as a large beam came crashing down, smashing into the bathtub and splitting it in half. Flames surged into the room, swallowing everything in their path. "Go! Go now!" Mr. Ajayi shouted, shoving his wife toward the window. "We need to try or we'll die here." She nodded, tears streaming down her soot-covered face. She climbed onto the ledge, but it was clear she wouldn't fit through. The smoke was too thick, she could barely breathe. Her body weakened, and she slumped back into the room, her strength giving way to the encroaching darkness. Mr. Ajayi, realizing their fate was sealed, pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her as the flames closed in. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry."